for January 23rd, 2012. As you know, I'm a great fan of the science section of Tuesday morning. So this was a couple of weeks ago. It's called Survival's Ick Factor. Disgust is the Cinderella of emotions. While fear, sadness, and anger, its nasty, flashy sisters, have drawn the rapt attention of psychologists, poor disgust has been hidden away in a corner, left to muck around in the ashes. No longer. Disgust is having its moment of delight, as researchers find that it does more than cause that sick feeling in the stomach. It protects humans from disease and parasites, and affects almost every aspect of human relations, from romance to politics. In several new books and a steady stream of research papers, scientists are exploring the evolution of disgust and its roles and attitudes toward food, sexuality, and other people. Paul Rosen, a psychologist who is an emeritus professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a pioneer of modern disgust research, began researching it with a few collaborators in the 1980s, when disgust was far from the mainstream. It was always the other emotion, he said. Now it's not. It still won't wear glass slippers, which may be just as well given the stuff it has to walk through. Nevertheless, its reach takes disgust beyond the realms of rot and excrement. Speaking last week from a conference on disgust in Germany, Valerie Curtis, a self-described disgustologist from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, described her favorite emotion as incredibly important. She continued, it's in our everyday life. It determines our hygiene behaviors. It determines how close we get to people. It determines who we're going to kiss, who we're going to mate with, who we're going to sit next to. It determines the people that we shun, and that is something that we do a lot of. It begins early, she said. Kids in the playground accuse other kids of having cooties, and it works, and people feel shame when disgust is turned on them. Some studies have suggested that political conservatives are more prone to disgust than liberals are, and it is clear that what people find disgusting, they often find immoral, too. Thus ended the lesson. Evolution of our shadow side. The first thing I should say is that this is not my Valentine's sermon. This is my evolution sermon. Charles Darwin was born 203 years ago today, and I observed his great influence in our thought by preaching on evolution at least once a year. Of course, I work it into other sermons as well, because it is such a huge part of our self-understanding. St. Valentine's Day is 2 days later, and I have often combined the two anniversaries by preaching on the evolution of love. This year I decided to do love next Sunday and concentrate today on some aspects of evolution that are not quite so positive. My title this morning, Evolution of Our Shadow Side, might be a little misleading, for the term shadow side was coined by Carl Jung as a psychotherapeutic analog to the Christian concept of sin. In other words, we espouse a certain type of morality, we preach righteousness, and then we find ourselves doing just what we said not to do. St. Paul says, that the good which I would do, that I do not. The evil which I would not do, that I do. But I'll deal with morality, but I want to start out with more basic emotions. Fear, grief, and particularly disgust. There's been a lot of work lately on the evolution of disgust, and it has been discussed, pun obviously intended, in the New York Times science section a couple of weeks ago, as I just read. I might have titled this sermon actually, The Evolution of Yuck. And one of the tasks I face right off is how to talk about yuck without being yucky. Different people have different sensibilities, of course, but I'm going to try to steer us close to disgust without motivating any of you actually to get up and leave the room. Some experiences of disgust are covered by a blessed kind of amnesia after they are over, and others stay with us and re-traumatize us as we recall them. But you may be asking, why is it worthwhile to talk about them in church at all? I come to church for this, you might be saying. I think there are three reasons these are worthy of our attention. One, these negative emotions happen to all of us. And when they do, they can be very upsetting. And if we can understand them in a larger framework, if we can make some sort of sense of them, they may be easier to cope with. Two, liberal religion is often accused of being a fair weather, feel-good faith, there for us when things are going well, and there for people in control of their lives and at the top of the social heap, and not so useful for the hard times, or the oppressed people, or the marginalized people. A religion for all the facets of the human experience has to deal with the negatives. And three, there's a kind of spiritual growth, I think, that happens from confronting the negative emotions, from, as the cliche goes, embracing your shadow side. So now a personal story. When I was in college, my girlfriend, who became my first wife later on, transferred to Boston University, where she had a roommate named Teresa. Teresa came from a fine Italian family in Springfield, and we were invited out there for the weekend. Teresa's mom made us a wonderful Italian dinner on Friday night, but midway through the meal, a phone call came in for Teresa's dad, who was the pathologist at the local hospital. It seemed that a patient had just died, and an autopsy would need to be conducted. Teresa's dad had a golf date for Saturday morning, so he said to me, "Do you want us to come see something interesting?" And so we went down to the hospital that Friday night, and that is how I got to see my first and only autopsy. It was performed in a spacious tiled room in the ground floor of the hospital. There was a viewing area on one side of the room where I stood behind a metal rail, but otherwise was in the same space as the good doctor and his assistant, and the body. The body was laid out on a stainless steel table, nude except for paper towels strategically placed on the crotch and the face. I was struck by the thought that this person had been alive eating her dinner only 2 hours before. The doctor was dictating as he worked, and a microphone over the table presumably fed a tape recorder somewhere out of the room. There were no bad smells, and I was just saying to myself, this isn't so bad, I can do this, when the doctor made the first cut all the way down the torso. At that point, it became graphically clear that the object on the table was not a person, but more like a piece of meat. And I began to feel the rumblings of the fine Italian meal I'd just eaten, threatening rebellion in my own stomach. But I suppressed my reflex reaction and did not leave the room. Rather, I focused on what he was finding in his examination. I remember he held up the lungs. They were not pink, but gray at the bottom, because this was a heavy smoker. Through the haze of 40 years, I can remember that brightly lit antiseptic room and how disgust welled up within me, but I overcame it with my own curiosity. Or maybe that wasn't all that was involved. There was probably a little bit of macho down there at work, I'm sure. I didn't want to show weakness in front of this doctor. But where does this disgust come from? The New York Times article I read earlier says that studying disgust has become very popular among evolutionary scientists. This is in part because disgust is such a well-defined set of physical attributes. Look at the face on the cover of this week's Order of Service. People from any culture on Earth, in any age over 4, would recognize the emotion expressed by that face as one of disgust. Evolutionary scientists like to start with things like this, with concrete traits. We can ask about the evolution of morality or consciousness or optimism, but these things are abstract and hard even to define, let alone study in a particular individual or culture. Evolutionary science is best at dealing with physical traits like blue eyes or opposable thumbs. And it gets into feelings, if it gets into feelings with a strong physical component are favored. Disgust has a well-recognized set of physical symptoms. So it's well suited for evolutionary explanation, but what is that explanation? It has long been thought that disgust evolved to avoid bad foods that can kill us or make us sick. And it's plausible. Among the things that threaten the health that's put into our bodies are our own body wastes, rotten meat, overripe or moldy fruits and vegetables, and other poisons. It is not hard to see that our ancestors who had disgust reactions to these potential killer foods would survive longer than those who didn't, and would pass these instincts on to their offspring. Similarly, a disgust for dead human bodies is well grounded in the fact that they often contain germs of diseases. Lately, some of the researchers have expanded that list to include sexual selection. We are attracted to the smell or taste of some potential mates and repelled by others. We don't quite know why, but there is some evidence which seems to suggest that taste and smell may be an aid in telling us which mates are genetically suited for us. A type of disgust reaction is also seen in the area of moral judgment. It is more prominent, as the article says, among the politically conservative than liberals. If you watch the Republican presidential debates or listen to conservative talk shows, you can see the candidates and pundits appealing to the disgust reactions of the voters and listeners. The stimulus varies. One day it may be the supposed war on Christmas, the next day food stamp recipients, the next day abortion. But the attempt is always to evoke a disgust reaction in the hearer. Disgust reactions can be powerful motivators. If I'm really witnessing something which is powerful enough to make me want to throw up, I'm going to do almost anything I can, either to get out of there or to turn it off. This is the stock and trade of conservative politics. But notice when we go beyond the chemical or physical motivators, how negotiable disgust can be. The pundits and the politicians on the right aren't just sure just what theme will work today. And if they get too racist, they're going to be called out on it by liberals. Disgust also, it's occurred to me, it can be used to sell products. Just in our restroom here, I come up with air scent, toilet paper. They would not be possible without disgust reactions. There are ways that the economy has figured out to make money off of our disgust reactions. Deodorant. What else? You could probably go through a supermarket and label products by the way that they're themed to disgust reactions. Last night, Lee Fuller and I went to the Gala Ball, something I've wanted to do since I came to the Cape. It was a glorious evening of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and straight folks. Men in dresses, women in tuxes, many same-sex couples showing affection, and soon to be dancing, though we had to leave before the dancing started. I reflected on how there would be some straight Americans today who would be profoundly uncomfortable, if not actually disgusted, in this group. And now there was certainly a time in my life when I would have been uncomfortable. By the mid-1980s in Charleston, I had a number of out gay and lesbian friends, but there was definitely a time when I was uncomfortable with public displays of affection between them. So at least some of our disgust reactions can be educated. In evolutionary terms, we can adapt. In my own history, the evolution of my moral thinking went something like this. I had responded to the civil rights movement in the 1960s by adopting the view that how white society, particularly in the South, treated blacks was wrong and needed to be changed. In the 1970s, I realized that closer to home, how men treated women needed changing. And in the late 1970s, I applied the same reasoning to gays and lesbians. Through the decades, my moral sense evolved, and my disgust reactions followed, though not immediately. More important, notice how different an explanation based on evolution is from one based on religious doctrine. Evolutionary science says if disgust enters into moral judgments, that is a borrowing of an instinct which originated for a different purpose, namely to protect us against diseases. Orthodox religions might teach this disgust reaction in the moral realm comes from the fact that we are born in sin and live our lives in sin because of what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. Unitarian Universalism, of course, rejects original sin, but because of this, it is often accused of being overly sunny and ignoring the more troubling emotions. It seems to me that evolutionary theory may be our answer to original sin, a science-based account of the negative aspects of the human condition. Let's look at another negative emotion, fear. Fear is another of our more troubling emotions, and many of us are crippled by it. But in evolutionary perspective, fear is not just something to be overcome and tolerated. Fear has a positive adaptive use. Fear keeps you out of trouble. You learn to avoid what is really dangerous. like hot stoves, or steep cliffs, or man-eating bears. Fearless humans may be extolled as heroes, may be the subject of epic poetry, or admiring ballads or first-run movies, but in the aggregate, they don't live long enough to pass on their genes to their offspring. And it is physically rooted. The flight or fight response is a well-recognized set of physical responses found in humans and many animals as a reaction to fear. But what triggers the flight or fight response, like what triggers disgust, might be quite abstract in humans. If you've just lost your job and wonder how you are going to pay your mortgage, you might have the same physical reactions, adrenaline, shortness of breath, trouble sleeping, that our ancestors had when they were about to be attacked by a saber-toothed cat. But your way of coping with the reaction will probably be different. Evolutionary theory itself evolves. Back in the early 20th century, social Darwinists taught that evolution was a great justification for just pure meanness. If there were huge inequalities of wealth and power, that was a result of the struggle of each against all, for survival of the fittest. Evolution was deemed to justify rugged individualism and rapacious capitalism. We still have these theories on the political scene that come from the followers of Ayn Rand. But in the present century, researchers emphasize the social nature of evolution, how we have instincts that reward cooperation, how we have the capacity for empathy, for reading one another's emotions in our faces, for adjusting our words and deeds to conform to the group. Evolution has given us troubling and painful instincts. What I want you to take away from this talk this morning is that we have to accept the shadow side as the gift of evolution. It is who we are. We have certain negative reactions and emotions in our makeup. It doesn't help us grow to pretend that they don't exist. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a tradition called Chud, which is concerned with cutting down the ego. And the practitioner tries to do this by confronting his or her own disgust reactions and deliberately imagining the things that are disgusting. The practitioner imagines his or her own body being cut up in pieces and served to others as food. I also read somewhere that in other traditions there is a practice of meditating while touching a corpse to confront the fact of one's own death in an immediate and tactile way. This is making the idea of impermanence into something very concrete. I mention these practices, though I confess I'm not prepared to engage in them myself. I think there is something heroic about sailing so directly into the teeth of our darkest instincts. But I also think it helps us cope with negative feelings to realize that they are a part of who we are, that they are the gift of evolution to us. It is certainly more helpful to put these feelings into an evolutionary perspective than to deny that they exist. And it also gets us out of that sterile question of where does evil come from? Why should there be evil? Because these negative feelings come from the very thing that got us survival, that got us here in the first place, that allows us our little 70 or 80 or 90 years in the sun life. The other day I was consoling a friend on Facebook whose wife had just decided to leave their marriage of 28 years. This struck home with me because my own first marriage came apart after 27 years. I was thrown back to that time of searing pain, and I remembered writing a poem then, saying that I knew how the earth must have felt when the moon was ripped from her side. I felt that I had a gaping wound through which my innards were falling out and trailing on the sidewalk as I went my way. Those, of course, were colorful, if disgusting, metaphors, but they mirrored the extent of the hurt I felt at that period of my life. I was trained to go into the ministry. I knew that the body, confronted with a massive wound, will try its best to cover the wound and eventually make scar tissue. I did not want to grow emotional scar tissue. I needed to be open to love. So quite consciously, I fought those instincts to close up. The instinct, when you have been deeply wounded, is to close up. It is good to recognize this because fighting it, keeping an open heart, is a daily battle. It's not just one once. It's one every hour. When we lose someone we love through death, divorce, geography, or alienation. The grieving we feel is part of the shadow side. It is one of the gifts of evolution. It is the converse of the ability to love that person in the first place. Evolution gives us these instincts. Some things we encounter will disgust us. Some things will frighten us. Some things will make us very sad. Those feelings are natural, and they are a part of who we are. But they are not all of who we are. We have a limited ability to make ourselves, to adapt to new situations, to fight the instincts, or to let others develop. Here's Darwin's birthday. Let us celebrate